In the beginning, there was Africa. And in Africa, there was us. All of us. This isn't mythology. This isn't speculation. This is the story written in our bones, our DNA, and the earth itself. A story that science has spent decades piecing together, one discovery at a time. Today, we're going to explore one of the most fundamental questions in human history. Where do black people come from? But here's the twist that might surprise you. This question is really asking, where do all people come from? Welcome to a journey that spans hundreds of thousands of years, crosses every continent on Earth, and reveals a truth more fascinating than any fiction. Black people aren't a branch of humanity. They are the root. Close your eyes and imagine East Africa, roughly 300,000 years ago. The landscape is harsh but beautiful. Grasslands stretch to the horizon, punctuated by acacia trees and volcanic mountains. This is where our species, Homo sapiens, first emerged. The earliest fossil evidence of modern humans was discovered in Morocco at a site called Jebel Irhoud, dating back about 300,000 years. But the majority of early human fossils have been found in East Africa, particularly in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Tanzania. These weren't just any humans. These were the first people who looked like us, thought like us, and whose descendants would eventually populate the entire planet. And here's what's crucial to understand. These first humans were black. They had dark skin, tightly coiled hair, and broad noses, adaptations perfectly suited to the intense African sun and heat. Dark skin, rich in melanin, protected against harmful ultraviolet radiation. Tightly coiled hair created an insulating layer of air between the scalp and the sun. These weren't random features. They were evolutionary masterpieces. For over 200,000 years, humans lived exclusively in Africa. Let that sink in. For the vast majority of human existence, everyone on Earth was African. Everyone was black. The diversity we see today, the spectrum of skin tones, hair textures, and facial features, all of that came later, much later. Scientists have proven this through something extraordinary: mitochondrial DNA. This genetic material passes from mother to child, relatively unchanged, creating a trail we can follow backward through time. When geneticists analyzed mitochondrial DNA from people all over the world, they made a stunning discovery. Every single person alive today can trace their maternal lineage back to a woman who lived in Africa roughly 150,000 to 200,000 years ago. Scientists call her Mitochondrial Eve. She wasn't the only woman alive at the time, but she's the only one whose maternal line survived unbroken to the present day. And she was African. She was black. For thousands of generations, humans remained in Africa, developing sophisticated tools, language, art, and culture. Then, sometime between 70,000 and 100,000 years ago, something changed. Small groups of humans began to venture out of Africa. Why they left remains one of anthropology's great questions. Perhaps climate change made some regions less habitable. Perhaps population growth pushed people to seek new territories. Perhaps it was simple human curiosity, that same wanderlust that would eventually take us to every corner of the earth and even to the moon. These migrants crossed into the Middle East, following coastlines and river valleys. From there, some turned east toward Asia, others west toward Europe. They adapted to new environments, new climates, and new challenges. And as they did, their bodies began to change. In northern regions with less sunlight, dark skin became a disadvantage. Vitamin D, crucial for bone health and immune function, is synthesized in the skin through exposure to sunlight. In cloudy, northern climates, people with lighter skin could produce vitamin D more efficiently. Over thousands of generations, natural selection favored lighter skin tones in these populations. But here's what's important. This wasn't the creation of a new type of human. This was simply adaptation. The genetic mutations that led to lighter skin, straight hair, and narrow noses are relatively recent and superficial. They affected appearance, but not the fundamental essence of what makes us human. Meanwhile, back in Africa, human populations continued to thrive and diversify. Africa is the most genetically diverse continent on Earth. There's more genetic variation among African populations than there is in all non-African populations combined. Think about that. The differences between a Nigerian and a Chinese person, or a Swede and a Peruvian, are actually smaller than the differences you can find between various African ethnic groups. This makes perfect sense when you remember that Africans had a 200,000-year head start on human diversity, while everyone else descended from a relatively small group of migrants who left Africa fairly recently in evolutionary terms. Throughout history, people have told many stories about human origins, often shaped by the prejudices and limited knowledge of their times. Some claim different races came from different species. Others suggested that black people were somehow less evolved. These ideas weren't just wrong. They were weapons used to justify terrible injustices. Modern science has demolished these myths completely. First, the concept of distinct human races has no biological basis. In 2000, the Human Genome Project confirmed that all humans share 99.9% of their DNA. The tiny 0.1% that varies does so gradually across geographic regions, not in neat categories. You cannot draw clear genetic lines between supposed races. What we call race is a social construct based on superficial physical features, not a biological reality. Second, the idea that evolution creates a hierarchy from primitive to advanced is fundamentally flawed. Evolution doesn't have a goal or direction. It simply describes how populations change over time in response to their environments. A person adapted to the Arctic isn't more evolved than someone adapted to the tropics. They're just evolved for different conditions. Third, the notion that ancient Africans were unsophisticated or primitive is contradicted by archaeological evidence. Blombos Cave in South Africa has yielded ochre pigments, shell beads, and engraved patterns dating back 100,000 years, clear evidence of symbolic thinking and artistic expression. The Ishango bone from the Democratic Republic of Congo, over 20,000 years old, shows mathematical notations. Ancient Africans were developing agriculture, metalworking, architecture, and complex societies while much of the rest of the world was still catching up. The Egyptian civilization, one of humanity's greatest ancient cultures, was African. The Kingdom of Kush, the Empire of Mali, the city of Great Zimbabwe, these weren't anomalies. They were expressions of the deep well of human ingenuity that had been developing in Africa for hundreds of thousands of years. The story of Black people doesn't end in Africa, of course. Through various waves of migration, both voluntary and forced, African people spread across the globe again, but this time in recorded history. The trans-Saharan trade routes brought Africans to the Mediterranean and Middle East for thousands of years. African sailors may have crossed the Atlantic long before Columbus. But the most devastating chapter began in the 15th century with the transatlantic slave trade. Over approximately 400 years, an estimated 12 to 15 million Africans were forcibly transported to the Americas. This wasn't just a tragedy of individual lives. It was a catastrophic disruption of families, cultures, languages, and traditions. Yet even in the face of unimaginable brutality, African people survived, adapted, and built new cultures that blended African roots with their new environments. The African diaspora created the foundations of civilizations in the Americas. African labor built much of the infrastructure of colonial America, the Caribbean, and South America. African cultural influences shaped music, creating blues, jazz, rock and roll, hip-hop, samba, reggae, and countless other genres. African spiritual traditions influenced religious practices. African culinary techniques transformed global cuisine. In more recent centuries, voluntary migration has taken African people to every corner of the world, where they continue to contribute to science, arts, politics, sports, and every other field of human endeavor. So what does all this science and history tell us? What does it mean that all humans originated in Africa, that the first humans were black, that we're all distant cousins sharing the vast majority of our genetic code? It means that human diversity is not a sign of fundamental difference, but of our species' incredible adaptability. It means that skin color, hair texture, and facial features are recent, superficial adaptations to different environments. They say nothing about intelligence, capability, or human worth. It means that when we look at a black person, we're looking at the human form in its original state, the template from which all other variations emerged. Black people aren't a deviation from some default human. They are, in the most literal scientific sense, the original humans. This doesn't make black people better than anyone else. Evolution doesn't work that way, but it should fundamentally change how we think about human diversity and challenge any notion that some groups are more authentically human than others. The story of human origins also reminds us of our deep interconnectedness. The imaginary lines we draw between groups, racial, ethnic, national, are remarkably recent inventions. For the vast majority of our species' existence, we were simply humans, living in small communities, trying to survive and thrive. Understanding this can help us navigate our modern world with more wisdom and compassion. When we recognize that the external differences between us are recent adaptations to different environments, when we understand that there's more genetic diversity within Africa than outside it, when we grasp that we all descend from the same small population of ancient Africans, it becomes harder to justify prejudice, discrimination, or the idea that some humans are fundamentally different from or superior to others. The origin of black people is, paradoxically, the origin of all people. The story begins in Africa with dark-skinned, coiled-haired humans who would eventually give rise to every population on Earth. Those who stayed in Africa maintained and diversified those original traits. Those who left adapted to new environments, developing lighter skin, straight hair, and other features suited to different climates. But beneath these superficial differences, we remain one species, one family, united by our shared African ancestry. The next time you meet someone, regardless of what they look like or where they're from, remember, you're meeting a distant cousin, descended from the same African ancestors who first walked upright on the savannah hundreds of thousands of years ago. That's not just a beautiful idea. It's scientific fact, and it's a truth that, if we truly embrace it, has the power to change how we see ourselves, each other, and our place in the grand story of human existence. The origin of black people? It's the origin story of humanity itself. And it all began in Africa,